In the year 2006, a movie came out entitled Stranger Than Fiction, which was written by Zach Helm. Will Ferrell plays a IRS auditor by the name of Harold Crick. And in the movie, which features lots of different actors that are well known, Emma Thompson, Dustin Hoffman, Maggie Gyllenhaal, and if you're an Arrested Development fan and a fan of Buster, Tony Hill makes an appearance as a friend in this movie as well. But in the movie, Harold Crick, the character, comes to realize at some point, without giving too much of the movie away if you've never seen it, that he is actually a character in a novel that's being written by Karen Eiffel, who is played by Emma Thompson, and becomes aware of the fact that she is narrating his life, that there is the question that comes up for him, is he in charge of what he's doing, or is she writing it? Is she writing in response to how he lives his life, or is he living his life in response to how she is writing? And how much power does he have to do something different about that? Dustin Hoffman plays a literature professor that helps him sort through those various options. And that feeling is familiar to us. Maybe we don't have a narrator that narrates our lives, but we do have inner voices that narrate our lives in so many different ways, voices and messages that we've heard since childhood that can sometimes move the plot along of our lives and make it seem like we're out of our own control, that we are dealing with messages, dealing with patterns that we've seen from our family system, or feel unable to overcome difficulties that we are a victim of. And we just live our lives as if we are somehow carrying out the story that someone else is writing. It's a painful feeling to feel that sense of being out of control and feeling like we cannot make a difference in our decisions and our lives in the way that we move forward. And maybe the worst fear that we have, many of us, is being somehow transforming into becoming like our parents. And what better image of that than the Progressive Insurance ad that reminds us of what it can look like when we become our parents and how we can avoid that. I'll share that with you.
We're at the movies and we need to silence our phone. Who knows where that button is?
I don't have silent.
Everyone does, right up here.
It happens to all of us. We buy a new home and we turn into our parents. What I do is help new homeowners overcome this.
Was that an adjustable spanner? Good choice, Steve.
Okay, don't forget, you're not assisting him. You hired him. You have nowhere to sit. You have too many. Who else reads books about submarines?
My dad.
Yeah.
Oh, those are...
Progressive can't protect you from becoming your parents, but we can protect your home and auto when you bundle with us.
Look at that. We're at the movies and we need to silence our phone. Who knows where that button is?
I am sure you all have seen that ad before and are very familiar with that. It is a reminder of what life can look like if we allow it to unfold for us. So living our lives in charge of who we are, that is the question of, can we do that? Can we somehow take charge of our lives? Can we somehow become the writers of our own story? And that is exactly what the poem that Portia Nelson shares with us and contributes to our lives. It's a serious thing of, can we overcome the painfulness of not being in charge of our lives, feeling like a victim, feeling like that maybe we're repeating the same mistakes over and over again, or finding ourselves in the same dilemma over and over again, or looking at our culture and feeling like we just can't overcome, we just can't seem to make an impact on what's going on around us. Portia Nelson reminds us in her poem that we do have the ability to make some choices, but we have to pay attention to the various chapters. It's not an instant snap your fingers and all of a sudden you're in charge of your life and telling your story. It is a progression, and that is one of the things I love about her poem. I like for us to look at it a little more intently, so I'm going to go back to the screens where we were looking at the poem and share that with you. In chapter 1, she introduces us to something that we all know very familiar. Walking down a street, seeing a deep hole in the sidewalk, falling in, feeling lost, helpless, not feeling like it is our fault, and taking forever to find our way out of that hole. And certainly we know that feeling of getting ourselves caught in a loop of pattern of life, or feeling like we can't overcome something from our history that keeps dragging us down. And we fall in constantly over and over again. Often when I deal with chemical dependency groups and provide spirituality, I use this poem because the language in this is very helpful to think about, one, being helpless and realizing in a 12-step program that the first step is recognizing that you are helpless. You are, in a sense, looking for an ability to overcome, but also the acknowledgement of the hole that is out there. Chapter 2 is a little bit different. You see the deep hole in the sidewalk, pretending that you don't see it, living in denial that these patterns are happening in our lives, and you fall in again. Can't believe it's the same, you're in the same place, but also still not acknowledging the fault, and still taking a long time to get out. In chapter 3 comes the transformation. A lot of chapter 3 is exactly the same as chapter 1 and 2, walking down the same street, deep hole in the sidewalk, seeing that it's there, falling in, recognizing it as a habit. But the difference and the transformation comes when I know where I am and it is my fault. In chapter 3, empowerment comes through awareness, through eyes being open, through realizing there is something I can do about my situation that I'm in. Knowing where I am, it is my fault, and getting out immediately. Chapter 4 tells us when we walk down the same street and the deep soul hole is there in the sidewalk, because we have acknowledged our power to transform our story and our lives, we walk around it. And then chapter 5 is just a further move away and transformation from those holes that we find ourselves in, realizing we don't even have to walk down that street. There are other streets that we can walk down. The beautiful image of transforming ourselves into powerful beings and taking charge of our lives is a welcome sight when we feel powerless, when we feel victimized, when we feel like we are caught in patterns of our lives that are unhealthy, and we want a way moving forward. The poem tells us that when we find ourselves in those holes, when we find ourselves in those patterns, our awareness, our eyes being open, our acknowledging our participation in that are all the keys to somehow embracing the power to transform our lives and to do something different, to become writers of our own narratives. As we celebrate African American History Month, one of the figures that stands out to me in our history is William Edward Burghardt Dubois, or W.E.B. Dubois as he's known. Dubois was a sociologist born in Massachusetts just a few years after the end of the Civil War in 1868. And think about this, having been born just a few years after the Civil War ended, Dubois died the day before the March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others delivered speeches on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. Think about the lifespan of Du Bois from the Civil War to seeing, almost getting a chance to see that culmination of the civil rights movement, which he was so much a part of. He was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. He is the founder of the NAACP. He is the founder of the Niagara movement that later evolved into the civil rights movement. And Du Bois taught sociology at Atlanta University, which is now known as Clark Atlanta University. This is where he wrote one of his most famous books, The Souls of Black Folks, while he was a professor there in the Atlanta area. He relocated to Ghana toward the end of his life and worked really hard to focus on his sociology teachings, but often when his writings came out, there was so much that he was pulling on the work of Karl Marx that during a time that it wasn't very acceptable, communism was a albatross that was put around his neck and would often make him not someone who was celebrated even in African American cultures. He relocated to Ghana and actually became a naturalized citizen of Ghana shortly before he died in 1963. He protested against injustices and used the phrase that he borrowed from Frederick Douglass, which was one of the greatest problems in our country is the problem of the color line. He certainly took charge of his own narrative. In his book, autobiography, the stories of Dubois from his own perspective, he goes through his understanding of the Reconstruction movement that happened after the Civil War and African Americans' participation in the Reconstruction. As I've been revisiting his autobiography this week and revisiting reading The Souls of Black Folks, I've been reminded of how much that he contributed to the narrative of who African Americans are and what they have contributed to our nation, and in a sense, debunking the false narratives that were out there to put that particular population in place by the dominant culture. Du Bois embraced the teachings of sociology and believed that the power is in us to change ourselves as we change the greater culture around us. He saw the challenge of not only changing the greater culture and helping the United States become a more progressive, open, not so racially divided country, but he also believed that African Americans could change the way they saw themselves in this country. He believed that African Americans were not powerless victims in the writing of history, victims for sure. But in his own words, he says, "We are not powerless victims in the writing of history, but we possess the pen of our future story." Think about that for a second. Not just powerless victims in the writing of our history, but we possess the pen of our future story. One of the concepts that Du Bois is most famous for in contributing to the sociological landscape of conversations is the concept of double consciousness. And he lets us in on an understanding of the tensions that African Americans often feel, even today, as they hold in tensions how they view themselves with how others view them. And I believe that Du Bois would be very comfortable with acknowledging that this is not just an African American experience, but it's an experience of all those who are oppressed in a culture or who are marginalized in a culture. So I believe that Du Bois would look back on history and see how women experience double consciousness as they are often hold in tensions, how they view themselves versus how others view them. I believe if Du Bois were here today, he would look around us and see how the LGBTQ community experiences double consciousness and how they live their lives, both viewing themselves, how they see themselves, but also having to hold intention and be responsible for how others view them. In a few weeks, we're going to celebrate International Transgender Visibility Day on the last Sunday in March. And certainly this is a community that has to constantly hold in tension how they view themselves versus how others view them. And the goal for Du Bois when he spoke of African Americans was not to just simply be aware of that double consciousness, but to actually use that awareness to rewrite the story and power to do something different and ultimately have a different outcome in our culture. I want to share his words from The Soul of Black Folks. And these are the words of Du Bois that I'm reading. "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, and I'm going to say a Negro, that's the word that he uses, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." The history of the African American is the history of this strive, longing to attain self-consciousness, to merge double self into a better and a truer self. Do you hear his words? The goal is to merge that double self, the awareness of that work, into a truer and a better self. Certainly, Dubois is an inspiration and a challenge to all of us as we work on becoming our better selves, as we look at our own lives and our own stories, and we think about the holes that we find ourselves in, the patterns that we feel locked up in, and we want to do something about it. Du Bois is a reminder that we can. We are empowered with pens in our hands to write our own story, to be the narrators of our own lives. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that we have a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We are not just powerless victims to our family systems, to society, to culture, to patterns. We have the power of our own pen to not just avoid the holes we keep falling in, but to walk down entirely different streets. So as we become our better selves, our truer selves, we have the ability then to better the world we live in and transform our culture around us. That is the work of the UUCC, to be a transforming, powerful force in our world around us. May it be so.